Hello, this is the Danny4 Foundation's podcast, where we discuss the ocean, the beating blue heart of our planet, the blue economy, transparency, accountability, and good governance, leadership and gender, and youth. I'm your host, Larry Chetty. Welcome to the program. This episode is the first in a mini-series dedicated to Africa during the month of May to celebrate Africa Day, which is on the 25th of May. In this episode, we speak to Dr. Donald Kaberuka, President Emeritus of the African Development Bank, on how development challenges in Africa can be administered through strong institutions. Dr. Donald Kaberuka is a Rwandan economist who has worked in banking and international trade for over a decade. He was the president of the African Development Bank from September 2005 until September 2015. Dr. Kaberuka has also served as Minister for Finance and Economic Planning in Rwanda for 8 years and is credited with helping to stabilize the Rwandan economy from the effects of the 1994 genocide. As a person who has experience in facilitating financing of development projects in Africa, Dr. Kaberuka shares his thoughts on how development challenges can be administered through a robust governance framework.
The way we think about development has gone through several cycles. In the 1960s, the dominant theory at the time, the ruling idea as we call it, was that it was about a resource gap. In other words, developing countries did not have enough resources, did not enough savings. So all we had to do through international grants and loans and bilateral cooperation was to try and fill the resource gap. In other words, money was the key. In the late 70s, we actually found out that money alone cannot deliver development. That is your own money or money borrowed or grants by other people. It's not enough. Money is needed, tons of it. But there is something else which is needed. Sound policies. Because if you have lots of money and bad policies, you'll get counter results to what you expect. Now, over time, we also realized that you could have lots of money and policies are good. But policies have to be implemented, they have to be executed. So there was this execution gap, implementation gap. Sometimes due to lack of capacity, sometimes due to lack of prioritization, a lot of things. So we began to think around issues of resources, policies, and execution, implementation. So many countries often lack one of these three. The second thing I wanted to say here is that when you go to business schools or public policy schools, they teach you something on policies, because I didn't mention the importance of sound policies. But what are sound policies? So sound policies have three characteristics. They have to be technically sound. That is not very difficult. You can hire people to make sure that your policies, whether it's in education, health, agriculture, the blue economy, that your policies, these are sound. But there is a second requirement. They must be politically feasible. Because the policies might be very sound, but they're not politically feasible at that point in time, either because of timing, phasing, financing, coalition building, all kinds of things. So you must make sure now they are sound, but also politically feasible. And now once you are through that, they must be implementable. They must be executable. I say this because I mentioned both policies and implementation in one. These key are so important. Now, for these things to happen, you need, of course, strong governance. Strong governance. But what does it mean? It's a word which is bandied about nowadays. But I think it is important to dissect it into its components. What is a well-governed country? A well-governed society must fulfill the following conditions. It does not have to resemble Danish democracy. democracies around the world look very different because of the history, the context, and so on. All of them are democratic in their own ways. I think part of the issue we have nowadays is that some rich countries think that unless you adopt their own system, then you have governance shortfalls. All right? That is not correct. Governance has a number of pillars which are key. Number one is that one must govern for all, not for some. It is nowadays called inclusivity. You can't govern just for men, not women. For particular ethnic groups, particular regions. It has to be fair governance for all, not for some. If you don't govern for all, if it's not inclusive, all right, it's not fair, it means that the society will deliver less than its optimum. So that's important. And where that lacks, it doesn't matter how much resources we have. The second is that there is this famous Greek philosopher, Aristotle, when asked about what is politics. His answer was, it is a collective effort by society to resolve common problems, or roughly something like that. And this Aristotelian definition of public policy, politics, is what I understand. So, what it means, you must deliver for the people, whether it is good education, sound health, physical security, so many things. These have to be delivered. We've had examples of fairly democratic governments which fail to deliver on education or health. But there's a third angle. You must run a clean government, especially when countries at lower levels of development. It's very important because the marginal value of each dollar is very, very high. All right? And citizens must see that if they're paying taxes, it is delivering things for them. Physical security, all right? Stability for the country, good education, good health, and so on. But then, there's the last one. You must be accountable. All of us are accountable in one or another. Now, when a government fulfills all those things, it says to me that institutions are working, they're strong, and it's a kind of governance framework which will deliver, irrespective of how poor or rich one countries.
This is the Danifo Foundation podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Donald Kaberuka, President Emeritus of the African Development Bank. Despite having robust institutions and elements of governance, Dr. Kaberuka explains the concept of social capital that underpins good governance.
One thing we learned during the COVID crisis was that some poor countries, developing countries, did very, very well on combating COVID, including yours. But some rich countries did very badly in response to COVID, say northern Italy. Of course, the issues around the demographics, too many elderly people and so on. But given the quantum of resources they had, they could have given a better response. They didn't. Why? It is something we call social capital. Right? In those countries, like mine here, which did quite well during COVID, vaccination here was about maybe 92% of all eligible people, sometimes 3 or 4 times, right? Because COVID tested both our health systems and our social capital. Social capital means trust, right? Means that ability to do things I've just described. And for me, that sums up governance. So governance is not some concepts we teach in public policy schools or in other forms of discourse. This is what for me constitutes elements of governance and thereby ability to deliver on development.
We do have a lot of development challenges in Africa. There's the population growth, there's drought and pandemics and all these challenges. And of course, there's governance, which is one of the challenges. So would you say that in order for Africa to move forward, like in fulfilling Agenda 2063, there need to be all these elements in place that you've just talked about for us to move forward in addressing those challenges?
Let me first of all disabuse you of the fact that governance is not simply a challenge for Africa. It's a challenge globally. Even countries who are highly developed. There's some serious governance challenges here, let alone on global issues, global commons. Right now, the geopolitics of the world is that we have absolutely almost near chaotic controls in the global governance. So the idea that this is challenges for Africa is not entirely correct. All right? Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. But I was putting it in the context of Africa. Yes.
I'm coming to that. Now, does that mean that to meet all those challenges you mentioned, we must have everything in place? No. That's not possible. Capacity to implement, for example, varies from country to country. So some of those elements might be missing, but we must be seen to be getting better every day towards attaining those goals. And there's no country, to my knowledge, which have attained development. All right? Some have got huge per capita incomes, but have a lot of inequality. All right? Despite high per capita incomes. Others have issues to do with what I've just described, social capital, trust within societies. All right? Others have dysfunctional political systems, very wealthy countries. I'll not mention names. All right? So we're all working towards improving governance in our countries so that we can attain our goals, but also so that we can resolve the common problems together. Now, African countries, we're 55 countries, members of the African Union. I don't want to lump all of them in one basket. You should always remember that. So we have some problems which are common to all of us, and others which are specific to some countries, depending upon the history and the context. So our ability to meet the Agenda 2063 will be a function of what we do in our own countries and what we do collectively, together. This is why I'm a big supporter of the Continental Free Trade Area, because that is what enables us to join our efforts, all right, to mutualize our abilities. So what we do in our countries and what we do together at regional level, at continent level, that's what will multiply our chances of reaching our goals.
That was Dr. Donald Kaberuka, President Emeritus of the African Development Bank, talking to the Danifo Foundation podcast on how development challenges can be administered through strong institutions. I would like to thank Dr. Kaberuka for making time for the interview. In our next episode, we speak to administered, Group President and Managing Director and Chairman of the Trade and Development Bank Group Executive Management Board. He will speak about how TDB is promoting good governance and sustainable development in Africa.
Sustainable development, of course, is very sensitive to a number of aspects around management, which is a subspace of governance. You need to have very strong management to ensure that economies are being well run, corporates and financial institutions are being well run. That requires competence, but it also requires good governance in terms of risk, in terms of what happens in boardrooms, in terms of following the rule of law.
Administered of the Trade and Development Bank, TDB, in the next episode of the Danifo Foundation podcast. Don't forget to follow us on Podbean, Spotify, Google Podcast, Amazon Music or Apple Podcast to keep up to date with weekly episodes. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.